We just listened to the first 2 episodes of a new podcast, and we want to tell you all about it.
The show is called Nobody Should Believe Me, and it's a groundbreaking investigation into Munchausen by proxy. Anyone who listens to Murder Sheet knows we really appreciate a deep dive into a subject. Well, no one has ever done anything of this depth and breadth on the topic before. You will be enthralled by the stories it tells, but even more importantly, you will learn a great deal about how to keep kids in your community safe from harm.
But what makes this show different is that the host of the podcast, novelist Andrea Dunlop, has a uniquely personal connection to this subject. Someone close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy a while ago. So to her, this is not just something that happens to other people. Her personal story really gives this show an emotional punch.
It also means she really makes an effort to get at the humanity of all of the people involved, all the victims and survivors. This isn't a podcast that focuses on the gruesome details. It has heart. Andrea really uses her storytelling skills to help us get to know the wide variety of people whose lives have been affected by Munchausen by proxy.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
A few weeks ago, on the Murder Sheet, we covered the story of the High's ice cream murders. You can find the whole story in our earlier episodes, but in brief, 2 young women were shot to death in the back of an ice cream store in Staunton, Virginia. William, or Bill, Thomas was arrested for that crime, tried, and acquitted. Decades later, a woman named Sharron Crawford confessed to the murders on her deathbed and alleged that the lead investigator on the case, David Bocock, knew she was guilty all along and covered up for her. We wanted to learn a bit more about the case and how it affected the community, and so we reached out to Courteney Stuart, one of the reporters who covered developments in the story after the confession. Courteney wasn't even based in the town where the murders happened. She worked for a newspaper in Charlottesville.
Staunton is 40 minutes from Charlottesville, so we were sort of reporting out of our area because it was such a crazy story.
This week on the Murder Sheet, Courteney tells us the wild story of the aftermath of the High's ice cream murders.
My name is Anya Kane.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Anya and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage.
We're the Murder Sheet, and this is the High's Ice Cream Homicides, covering the case. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, how you came to be a journalist?
Sure. So I was actually late to the game of journalism. I was a psychology major in college, thought I would go to law school or med school or get a PhD in like forensic psychology or something, and I kind of floundered around. I ended up getting an internship in Richmond, Virginia at a weekly newspaper called Style Weekly in the mid-90s. And it was my absolute first foray into journalism, just something I thought maybe I would like. It turns out loved it. Turned out it was a great match. And so I went from this unpaid internship, then got hired in a, a calendar editor kind of position, and just went from there. And I moved to Charlottesville and got in with the weekly paper, the first weekly paper in Charlottesville called Seaville Weekly in the late 90s. And then the Hook newspaper was founded in 2002 after there was a rift between the owners of Seaville Weekly, and one of them went off and started this new paper. And so I was the first employee at the Hook newspaper, which launched in early February of 2002.
And can you tell us a bit more about the Hook and sort of what the atmosphere was like to work there at the time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was a thrilling time for me professionally, because it was a newspaper that I was a founding staff member of. I mean, the first staff member. And so we started out and we were just going to be kind of like a regular alt weekly, but there was already an alt weekly with kind of a heavy arts emphasis in town. And so as we looked for ways to differentiate, we realized that there was this niche for long form investigative journalism. And we just started kind of moving in that direction over the years until we never entirely got rid of arts and lifestyle coverage, but we really minimized it and became really all about local investigative journalism. And not all of it was long form, but it was just all news all the time. And it was just really formative for me and really just like a dream for a journalist.
And what was sort of your niche or your beat within that newsroom?
So I think I started gravitating early on towards crime and criminal justice stories. And then probably as a result of doing a few, they start coming to you. People start thinking of you as, oh, that's the person who does that kind of story. And so over time, I really specialized in crime reporting, criminal justice issues as well. And that really became kind of my niche and my wheelhouse.
What made you sort of gravitate towards crime reporting?
Well, I mean, I think one of my early career goals was to be Clarice Starling from Silence of the Lambs, like an FBI agent, hunting serial killers or something. I'd always thought I would do something kind of forensic. I've always loved investigating. I love puzzles. And there was something about that and sort of just the psychology in all of these stories, not so much the gratuitous violence, but just all of the human condition that ends up in these true crime stories, both on the side of the perpetrator and then victims trying to survive this and how they come through these things, and just the family members, and also like a desire to find some sense of justice or have some impact for families who have been deeply harmed in some of these stories.
And then I guess, in terms of the context of the area, could you go into sort of, having carved out this niche within the newsroom and with the Hook kind of being at the forefront of covering crime in the area, what was crime like in the general area, Charlottesville and the surrounding environs?
Well, you would think that being a true crime reporter in a small college town like Charlottesville would be kind of a slow beat. In Charlottesville itself, I don't know if it's like a Bermuda Triangle kind of situation, but just bizarre things happen. It's not that the crime rate is high, it's that the crimes that were happening were just bizarre. Just all kinds of things. I mean, we over the 10 years or so, 12 years that the Hook was in operation, I mean, there was basically like 2 serial killers operating in the area, and then there were these other crimes that were just the motivations. I mean, they were sort of made for TV. We were constantly having the national news outlets come, and I would be joking, they really should just set up a bureau here because they keep having to come back. I mean, some of the cases that people might be familiar with from Charlottesville, Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham, who were both murdered by Jesse Matthew. The UVA lacrosse murder with George Hughley was another case that was here. So these were high profile cases that were bringing CNN and Fox and other Washington Post and New York Times down to the area on a regular basis.
Yeah, I was a student at William and Mary when Hannah Graham disappeared. I remember it was awful. Yeah.
Oh, so horrible.
Yeah.
And then other like less high profile cases, but just tons of them. Yeah. I mean, it really was a remarkable time to be reporting, locally, and to be sort of the only one on the ground doing these kind of long investigations into these cases. And Staunton is not, it's about 30 to 40 minutes. basically west of Charlottesville, maybe northwest. And so it's another small college community, but just central Virginia and sort of, where it's at the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's scenic, it's beautiful, and it's historic. And you just wouldn't think of these terrible crimes happening in this kind of bucolic setting.
So it's sort of like the cliche about, true crime, where it's like a town where you wouldn't think something like Highs would happen. Is that kind of the case for Staunton?
Absolutely. Yeah. You would not think, just that has all the elements. It's just a bizarre case.
And I guess before you reported on sort of the fallout from that case, the Thomas lawsuit, I suppose, had you heard at all about the Highs ice cream murders?
I had because, I had talked at various times with my colleagues and with people in the community about strange cases or things. And so it had come up, it was a murder case I'd heard about, but I really didn't know very much about it until there was this deathbed confession that one of my colleagues covered for The Hook. So typically the same reporter would continue covering a case. And my recollection is that Lindsay Barnes, who was the reporter for us, who had done the original story on the case and who did a really great job, had left the paper. I think he had gone on to law school. At that point, it's somebody else is going to pick this up. And this was a really significant development with this man who'd been a suspect, or one of the suspects in this case, suing the city for $200 million.
Let's take a quick break from the murder sheet to tell you about a podcast investigating yet another unforgettable crime. The Orange Tree is a 7-part series about a 2005 homicide that happened near the University of Texas at Austin. The murder of 21-year-old Jennifer Cave, who was shot, dismembered, and left in a bathtub at her friend Colton Petoniak's apartment, continues to haunt the area to this day.
Like the Burger Chef murders, this case features plenty of twists and turns, including Colton's flight to Mexico with another UT student, Laura Hall. Both were later convicted in connection with the crime, although Colton has continued to appeal his verdict and claim innocence. The business student turned convicted murderer now says that he doesn't even remember much about the night Jennifer died.
The Orange Tree is reported on and produced by Haley Butler and Tanu Thomas, who were both seniors at the University of Texas when they started this project. Together, Haley and Tanu strive to piece together this tragic story in an in-depth podcast that features audio from courtroom scenes and interrogation rooms, prison phone calls, and exclusive interviews with both the perpetrators and the victim's family. You can binge all 7 episodes of The Orange Tree today on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the murder sheet. And can you tell us a bit about your, reporting process as you sort of picked up where Barnes left off and sort of started getting into this?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, I was familiar with the story from him doing it, and I had been sort of in an editor role some on his story, so I already knew the details of it. But I was, when somebody sues the city with the allegations that were in the lawsuit that he filed, it's shocking. The amount was shocking, but the allegations were also, I think, even more shocking than the amount he was asking for. And so, I got the criminal complaint, and read that, and then started reaching out, and I was able to reach Bill Thomas, the man who filed suit, and speak with him. And, I reached out to all the people that were involved, just to try to find out what was going on here.
Can you tell us about some of the allegations that he made in his lawsuit?
Yeah. So he had been tried and acquitted in the death of one of the 2 girls, young women that were killed. And he alleged that the lead investigator who had investigated the murders knew that he was innocent, and he had covered it. He had been protecting the real killer, this woman who had worked at Highs, Sharron Crawford. And it was it's like a small town, and so people tend to stay. I find this with some other cases that I've done, and I'm covering these small town crimes. The same people who were there 40 years ago are still there, maybe in a slightly more advanced position, or but they're still there. So So the mayor at the time of this was a police veteran for the department. So it was just, it pulled and he was named in the suit. And so it pulled local politicians and the police department and then this high profile case that in Staunton, was a big deal. It was gripping.
How did the community react to the lawsuit and the allegations that he made?
Well, I think there was shock. I don't actually live in Staunton, so I can't say, from personal experience exactly how people have reacted in the years since then. But I mean, this was definitely, these allegations were really disturbing, and Sharron Crawford had confessed, on her deathbed 2 years earlier. So it was clear that he wasn't, he wasn't just trying to get out of something. I mean, he really had been under indictment, and now somebody had confessed. So it was clear that this guy had been harassed and targeted for years.
What do you remember about Mr. Thomas himself? You mentioned that he represented himself, and this had a pretty crushing impact on his life.
Yeah, I didn't meet him in person. I spoke to him by phone. I just remember him just describing what he had been through over 40 years, his frustration. He was representing himself. I mean, he'd had a hard life. And, I just remember thinking, that's just really awful. For 40 years, it's one thing to, that if all the evidence is pointing to you and you just they happen to be getting the wrong person, but to think that people knew that you were the wrong person and targeted you anyway, I had a lot of compassion for him. And I just remember him, sounding incredibly frustrated with what he's going through and really sounding like he had suffered.
Was anyone on sort of the town side of things, whether that's the police department or former detectives who were named or even not named, was anyone able to give you that side of the story, or were they kind of close-lipped?
I spoke with the attorney that was representing the city. My recollection is that because this was this was a lawsuit, the people named in the suit wouldn't speak with me directly. So I was speaking with the attorney who was representing them. And they were claiming that he wasn't harassed and it wasn't hanging over his head.
What ended up happening with the lawsuit?
The lawsuit ended up being dismissed.
I wanted to ask you, the figure I think who really loomed large despite being dead, within this trial was Dave Bocock. He's the lead investigator. He's the guy who discovered the girls dying in the ice cream shop. He's there from the beginning, and then it turns out he's mentioned in this deathbed confession as covering up the real killer. I guess my question for you is, what did you learn about him?
Right. I mean, the allegations and his involvement or his alleged involvement, it's shocking, that he would be the person, but she alleged in her deathbed confession that he helped her bury the murder weapon. I mean, so it wasn't just Bill Thomas making allegations. I mean, Sharron Crawford on her deathbed was basically saying, yeah, he did this. And then he had been demoted in 1980, I think. I'm not looking at it right this second. I looked at it earlier. He had been demoted, but I don't think he was ever held accountable for or publicly accountable for what happened, unless I'm not aware of it. He had been demoted from investigation to auxiliary service in 1980, and that was when the mayor at the time of this lawsuit was deputy chief of police. So it seems to me, just, I don't know whether that demotion was related to this case. I don't have that specific knowledge, but it certainly seems suspicious. And then there were the allegations in the suit, which I don't know. I mean, they're allegations that he had been romantically involved with Sharron Crawford, might have even had kids with her. But as far as I know, no DNA testing was even done. So, I mean, there were allegations of really, really egregious involvement and corruption. So I think if the lawsuit had gone forward, we might have gotten more answers about that. And as it is, I mean, there are allegations, and my understanding is he's dead. And Sharron Crawford's dead. So I'm not sure how we would learn more about it at this point.
Can you discuss some of those more egregious allegations that were in the lawsuit?
Well, I mean, I think if he has fathered children with the real murderer and then helps her cover it up, I think that's pretty egregious, if that's true. In his position as a law enforcement officer, that he would do that and would allow this other guy to be living under a cloud of suspicion for decades. I guess that's what I mean by potentially egregious, if that's true.
We've also read that it was alleged that he might have been her father.
He might have been Sharon Crawford's father.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't. If that might be in Lindsay's story. Maybe I did hear that. Oh my God!
Isn't that crazy?
The whole thing is so sordid. It's like,
it's like which is worse?
Yeah. What is going on in these small towns?
I guess for you as a journalist who covers crime and who still covers crime, on a true crime podcast, how did this case sort of and the sort of shocking outcome influence how you think about crime?
I think for me, the thing that is always compelling is just the human potential for good and evil, and the complexity of people's, psychology, and the fact that, people have all kinds of motivations for doing, terrible things. And, I think people have the potential for great good and great evil. And so, a case like this just shows that no matter how small the town or no matter how idyllic the setting, if there are humans involved, things can get really messed up.
I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about your own true crime podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I work on a true crime podcast called Small Town Big Crime. I have two colleagues who are both journalists, one of whom I co-write. We do all the reporting and the writing. And then our other partner does the sound, and she is the host. So she hosts the podcast. And so it's kind of a long form thing. We started working on it in really late 2018, but we got serious about it in 2019, and it's been this kind of insane live investigation. So it's just taking us forever to get to the end of it, because we keep making progress in this old case, the murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom in Bedford County in 1985. And Jens Soering and his then girlfriend Elizabeth Haysom, who were both UVA students at that time in 1985, they both, Elizabeth Haysom pled guilty. Jens Soering was convicted at trial, but has at his trial and since then claimed that he gave a false confession and that he only did it to protect her, and that, that somebody else actually committed the crime. And so over time, there's been some DNA stuff that's come out since that Jens and his team have said points to alternate suspects, two unidentified men. And so our podcast has been an effort to answer some of those questions and to figure out whether two other people really bled at the scene, and what what happened at trial and what the evidence really shows.
That sounds fascinating. Virginia, though, geez.
That's what I'm talking about. These small towns. These things are nuts. Like just, weird cases. So it goes back, at least that far. So maybe things are weird in other places too. I just keep thinking, like, what is up with, Central Virginia?
Yeah.
It's been, actually, and then I don't think there have been any of these high profile, like really bizarre crimes, but that's because since 2017, Charlottesville had August 12th, and we were like the magnet for the Confederate monuments and the tiki torches and, murderous rampage that the neo-Nazis went on. And so, since then, it was that. So it's like, it never gets to just be like a quiet town.
Yeah, I always felt like that you guys couldn't get a break, at least when I was in Virginia.
I know, it's like, great. We just get through all this stuff, and now like Charlottesville becomes like almost a shorthand for white supremacist violence. So yeah, as a journalist, it's like, okay, well, we're busy. We got plenty to do. But like as a resident, you're like, this is really hard on this community.
We would like to thank Courteney Stuart again for speaking with us this week. Her own true crime podcast, Small Town Big Crime, is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on the Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Sheet, and on Facebook at MSheet Podcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to the Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.